Over on Jaguar 7, a new baseball video is out. In this video, we talk about a bizarre broadcasting decision that ESPN made during the 1991 season, and how it might just be the worst broadcasting decision they ever made when it came to baseball. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. When a player usually gets drafted, it's the highlight, or one of the highlights, of their entire life, and understandably so. For years, these guys idolized the pros, and watched them on TV, aspiring to be just like them one day. And now, they get that opportunity. They put years of hard work and sacrifice and blood, sweat, and tears into trying to continue to play football. And now, they're getting a chance to be professional athletes and get paid to play the sport that they love so much. They're one of the top 0.1% of the top 0.1% of people to ever play the sport, and they're now being recognized for it. It is an incredible moment for the player, for his support group, for his family, and for everyone who's been there for him every step of the way. And if there are any tears when a player gets drafted, those are definitely not tears of sadness. Those are tears of joy. Those are tears knowing that you made it, and knowing that the stress of the entire draft process, which is nothing short of exhausting, is finally over. That was, except for one player. Because during the 1993 NFL Draft, when the Green Bay Packers made a selection in the 7th round and chose a particular player, that player was devastated, and to some extent, tried to talk the Packers out of taking him in the first place. It wasn't that he didn't want to play in Green Bay. Far from it, in fact. Rather, it was due to news that he received right before the call was made that devastated him, crushed his spirits, and ruined what should have been a celebratory and momentous day. Because this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances, the saddest draft pick in the history of the Green Bay Packers, and maybe even the history of the NFL Draft. Before I talk about the reason that the man in question was upset, we need some context to understand just who this man was in the first place. This man right here is defensive tackle Bob Kuberski, and when he was in college, he was an absolute menace on the defensive line, especially during the 1992 season, when he had 10 tackles for a loss and clogged up the middle. Navy was not a good football team in 1992. In fact, they were one of the worst in the country, going 1-10 and having the 3rd worst offense in all of Division 1A. However, if there was one bright spot, and if there was one glimmer of hope in what was a disastrous season, it was the play on the defensive line of Kuberski. To give you an idea of how good Kuberski was for the midshipmen, the last time a Navy football player had been drafted was Napoleon McCollum in 1986, and prior to him, it was Phil McConaughey back in 1979 and Glenn Nardi in 1973. You had one player from Navy get drafted in the last decade and a half, 2 players get drafted in the last 20 drafts, and just 3 players from Navy get drafted in the past quarter century. But Kuberski was that good that the scouts were looking closely at him. As Navy's head coach said, there aren't many defensive linemen who are as good as Bob. He's an All-America candidate because he's played All-America ball against top competition. When Navy announced their all-time team in 2009, Kuberski was one of the 7 defensive linemen listed, and it's not hard to see why, especially since he was named the team's MVP that season. For Kuberski, who thought he had no shot at the pros coming out of high school and enlisting in the Naval Academy, this felt surreal that teams were contacting him and were approaching him to possibly become the first Navy defender in 20 years to get drafted. And for the Packers entering the 1993 NFL Draft, there seemed to be a clear emphasis on improving the front 7, seeing as their run defense was quite poor, as they ranked 16th out of 28 teams in rushing yards allowed, and more importantly, 26th out of 28, or 3rd from the bottom, in yards per carry allowed. This was especially highlighted at the end of the season, when in a must-win game to make the playoffs, not only did they lose 27-7 to the Minnesota Vikings, but they allowed 165 rushing yards in the process, and allowed Terry Allen to average 5 yards per carry. Green Bay was stocking up on defenders like people in 2020 were stocking up on toilet paper, As of the 9 picks they had, 6 of them were on the defensive side of the ball, with 3 coming in the front 7. And the final one of those picks? None other than Bob Kuberski, taken with pick 183. Just like that, Kuberski had made history. Kuberski had a pretty good idea that Green Bay was interested in him, seeing as the Packers had him out on an official visit, and he was super impressed with Green Bay, albeit a bit shocked. As Kuberski said on visiting Green Bay for the first time, "I couldn't believe how small it is." After we left the airport, the Packers representative said, "We're almost there." I said, "What do you mean?" "It was like a suburb." "I'm thinking Philadelphia with skyscrapers. Green Bay's small, but it's nice and clean." And 2 years before the draft, Ron Wolf found out about him courtesy of Navy's coaching staff, so he was on Wolf's radar and the Packers' radar for a while. But now, it was official. Just like that, Kuberski was officially an NFL player, and it should have been a joyous occasion. He was going to a good team that needed his services. He was going to a place that he seemed to really like, and he was going to live out his dream. But when Kuberski got the phone call, he was upset and heartbroken, and it wasn't because of tears of happiness or anything like that. You might be asking yourself, even though Navy is a Division 1A school, and even though the NFL draft was essentially a marathon back then, with hundreds upon hundreds of picks and many rounds, why did the midshipmen only have 3 players taken in the last quarter century before Kuberski? And as you might have been able to guess, Navy is not like other schools. Because when you sign up to go to Navy, you have to fulfill a military commitment after you graduate. That's the whole trade-off of going there. You don't have to pay for college, but you do have to give up years of your life to serve the country, which in this case, seemed to be 5 years. And it's easy to see why a lot of GMs wouldn't take guys that they knew couldn't play for them for a few years. Aside from the fact that they might not even be in game shape anymore by the time they're ready, their roster status is always up in the air. And the GM usually doesn't have 5 or so years of job security. You've got to be super confident in a player's skills to still be there after he serves, or even be alive depending on what war the country is in and what his role is. You have to be confident that the player is still going to want to play football. And you have to be confident in your own job status and the job status of the coaching staff. Now, there were some exceptions where you could appeal to have your service delayed or to do other things, like fulfilling it in the off-season. The idea with a lot of these appeals with pro athletes is that even if they don't wind up serving, the fact that they went to the school is fantastic publicity and might encourage other athletes to join the academy. It's free advertising. And Kuberski was in the middle of appealing to have his service time delayed, because in his eyes, everything was entirely up in the air. He had no idea whether he was going to be able to play right away or not, especially after the bizarre debacle with Napoleon McCallum, who got to play in 1986 while fulfilling part of his service requirement, and then the Navy said, "Never mind, change of plans. You can't do that anymore," after that season, meaning that he couldn't step on the field again until 1990, at which point he was nowhere close to the player he was in 1986 when he was the runner-up for AP Offensive Rookie of the Year. It was a situation-by-situation and a case-by-case basis, and Kuberski was feeling pretty good about having his service delayed to play football and to work in the off-season. On one hand, Kuberski couldn't participate in the NFL Combine or any games like the Senior Bowl because of his commitment. On the other hand, the country wasn't in any wars, so it wasn't a time of crisis for the USA. And at 12:20, when the Packers officially drafted him, Kuberski was upset. Because at noon, just 20 minutes before getting the news that he was an NFL player, the Naval Academy finished its appeal process and let him know that he was denied. He could not continue his pro football career while completing specialty training for the Navy. He could not juggle both of these at the same time. Not even 20 minutes before he heard his name called, he heard the bad news that even if it did get called, it wouldn't matter, because he wouldn't be able to play right away and would have to work for a few years. What was supposed to be the happiest day of his football career and the day that he would learn that he would get to continue playing turned out to be the saddest, and the day that he learned that he couldn't. And instead of being excited when Kuberski got the phone call from Ron Wolf, he mustered up no excitement at all. How could you? As Kuberski said, "I apologized to Mr. Wolf. I told him I wasn't as happy as I wanted to be. It really dashed my hopes." A draft pick apologizing because he got drafted, essentially telling Wolf, "I'm sorry you believed in me and wanted to draft me, but I can't do this. I can't play. I'm sorry I let you down." He continued saying, "When Mr. Wolf gave me the call, I told him, I'm sorry I'm not as excited as I should have been, because I just got the letter." Normally, the draft phone calls are a formality. The scouts and the GM and the coach have all agreed on who the pick should be, and the call is just to let the player know the news. But now, it was anything but that, as the Packers were presented with critical new information mid-call, especially since Kuberski was stunned by the news himself, saying, "I would have been given extra military service. It seemed as if I was going to be approved. I don't know what I'm going to do now." But as you've probably been able to tell from these highlights, despite the news, it didn't stop the Packers from drafting him and from making him their 7th round pick. As Wolf said, "We looked quite extensively at the situation with his commitment. The thing was, we had an extra pick, having 9 in the first 8 rounds. If we're fortunate and he gets out early, fine. If he serves his 5 years, fine. He has more than enough ability to play at our level, and play quite well. He has a great first step, and once he gets into a situation where he doesn't have to get up at 6:30 in the morning and go to bed at 11:30 at night, where he can get stronger and way more, it's going to benefit him. In other words, you're a 7th round pick, and you've got tons of potential. If it doesn't work out, no harm, no foul. But we're thinking long term here, and we know the predicament that you're in. Absolutely stinks with what happened, and especially with how terrible the timing was. Literally, it happened right before the Packers made the call. But we'll figure something out. I know you're upset, but we're still going to draft you, and we'll still stick with you." And I think it's fair to say that the Packers made the right choice. Because even though Kuberski couldn't play from 1993 to 94, he was finally back onto the field in 1995, and even played 4 seasons with the Packers, starting a handful of games as a pretty solid run stuffer. For some perspective, in 1997, Kuberski started 3 games as defensive tackle, with his job being to clog up the middle. In those 3 games, the Packers only allowed 3.9 yards per carry, including just 2.4 in their game against the Buffalo Bills. In the other 13 games, they allowed over 4.2 yards per carry. Kuberski got a ring out of all of this, as he was on the roster when the Packers played in Super Bowl 31, and he was a solid contributor in the run defense, with some nice 3rd and 4th down stops along the way, which is all that you can ask for out of a 7th round pick. You want a guy that can contribute in any way whatsoever, and Kuberski did that, even if it was a few years delayed. So it all worked out in the end. But that doesn't change the fact that the day that Kuberski got drafted was an awkward one for just about everyone involved. The draft is supposed to be the day that you continue your football career. And here was Kuberski, finding out at the worst possible time that his career was going to be put on hold. Because in 1993, even though the Packers chose Kuberski with pick number 183, he was sniped a few picks earlier by another team, who didn't need him to clog up the middle on the defensive line, but rather, who needed him to serve and defend the United States. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.